My name is Kendall Jones. I'm with the Global Sport Institute, and we're excited to have you all with us here today to talk about Global Sport Matters live with COVID-19 and the reset of sport. We have a fabulous panel lined up for you, as well as our host, Kenneth Shropshire from the Institute as well. And just to kick things off, we'll test your chat by asking a couple of questions. So first off, let us know where you're calling in from. Let us know what country, what part of the world. Let us know where you're calling in from. And also, because we're talking about reset of sport, we thought it would be interesting to know, we're going to be talking about the return of sport, right? So let's say that this Sunday is the big game. It's Super Bowl, it's the World Cup final, and you have tickets. It's this Sunday, it's in your country. Would you attend? Let us know in the chat box. And with that, I am going to go ahead and turn it over to you, Ken.
Thanks, Kendall. Hello, everyone. And as someone said, welcome to the new abnormal. So we're glad to get a chance to talk with you in what we're calling our global sport conversations, and more formally, Global Sport Matters Live. And we really do want you to think about this as an informal conversation. We are checking out your chat responses. A lot of people saying no, they would not attend, although we see somebody from a location I can't determine who says they would attend. I'm not going anywhere for a while. That is my viewpoint. But what we really want to try to get into, though, and I'll introduce our panelists in a moment. It's a question, a comment that was raised in our last live session by Professor Simon Chadwick, and that was, is this a time to reset sport? And should we take advantage of this moment, and how should we do it? So in this kind of reboot moment, we want to know, are we ready? What should it look like? How can we improve sport? And we'll look at some specific areas with that. We've got some great guests, some great fellow conversationalists to get us through that. Our one returning guest, not that everybody else wasn't great the first time around, but some specific issues that we want to get back to from Australia. Tracy Holmes, she's an Australian journalist and presenter on ABC News Radio, and great podcast, The Ticket. If you want to try to feel like you are more global on a regular basis, do tune in to her podcast, The Ticket. My good friend, award-winning sports journalist, author, most recently the book Full Dissidence, Notes from an Uneven Playing Field, and author of many other books, including Shutout. Howard Bryant joining us from the Massachusetts area. And finally, Victoria Jackson, sports historian and clinical assistant professor of history at ASU, a professional track and field athlete, and my colleague here at ASU, Victoria Jackson. Thanks. So let's start off with Tracy, and let's try to figure out what's going on down there. And in terms of our reset kind of question, Tracy, let's think about what you guys are doing there. And really, when we were thinking about doing this session number 2, we said, let's bring in an all new guests. And then we saw your tweet, which I'll ask to be brought up now, which made us realize, it might be good to have Tracy back on again. So the tweet up on the screen now, and doing my tweet translation reading, fantastic that the leaders and the broadcasters of rugby want to come back. They're all in furious agreement, and maybe an Australian framing there, about a return, but there is no game without the players, without the rugby players. Surely their concerns remain paramount to any return. Tracy, what's going on down there? As we think about this return of sport, you framed this fantastically. What's going on with rugby in Australia, and how did this come about?
Well, it's been quite interesting because we've actually seen the departure of the CEO of the game, of NRL, as we call it. And he made way because there was a new chairman that came in this overriding arm called the Australian Rugby League Commission. And this chairman is very bullish. He runs horse racing in the state of New South Wales. And he was appointed chair of this independent commission, but he's gone in there and really taken control of this. He was very adamant that rugby league was going to be the first sport back in action. And given that his interpretation was the numbers were low of COVID infections here in Australia, the numbers were dropping quickly. He'd been involved before with a pandemic of sorts in the horse racing industry with equine flu. And he knew how to deal with that. He knew all of these security experts that he got involved to have a look at the mapping in rugby league. And he said, okay, we're going to come back on May 28. Every other sport in the country kind of looked at him sideways like he was joking, but he's been very firm on that and continues to be firm on that. So he had a bit of a battle with the broadcasters who said, well, we're not sure we want to broadcast a sort of dodgy competition. It better be a full competition or not at all. He's had to renegotiate some of their fee structures on that. Then he had a bit of a battle with the clubs saying, well, we're based in different states. We've got one team that's actually based in New Zealand that would need to fly in here and be quarantined and not go home for the next 5 months, which means not seeing any of their families. And they're a very family-oriented club. And then the players themselves saying, well, hang on a sec, we'd love to come back because this is what we do. But we want to make sure that you have got considered situations like our hospitals have been shut for elective surgery. So if one of us gets injured, instead of being able to go and have surgery very quickly on a torn hamstring or a busted knee or a shoulder, if we can't do that and recover, you're talking about our career being put at risk. So we've got a whole series of questions to be answered from the players group. So they're working through that now. It looks like they've come to an agreement with the broadcasters. It looks like they've got dates firmed up for a competition. But now we've got all the governments saying, well, Australian Border Force hasn't given approval for the New Zealand team to fly in. The various state governments now have to give approval for their teams to fly out, be based in one state, or whether they can fly home when they're not playing, all of these other issues. So there's still some way to go, but I've actually got confidence in this man being able to bring back rugby league on May 28. But there's still a long way to go, particularly with the players and their concerns.
What leverage do the players have? And again, today we had or maybe it was yesterday, a tweet from LeBron sort of putting a stake in the ground. We are coming back at some point when it's safe. And then people, oh, LeBron said it, let's listen to LeBron. Similar leverage by players?
Not really, but it's been growing towards the American model. So I know the idea of a partnership in American sport is quite firm. I think NBA is the greatest, isn't it? With it's like 51%, isn't it, of revenue that goes back to the players. In Australia, we've been looking at the American model for some time and been building towards it. But the Rugby League Players Association actually have had quite a bit of leverage. They had quite a good relationship with the previous CEO who departed just a couple of weeks ago. But they get 29% of broadcast revenue. But what they've noticed in this latest negotiation, and this very bullish chairman whose name is Peter V'landys, is that they feel like they're not being treated in the same way as they were previously. And V'landys says all the right things, and he says, we're all partners in this and we're all equal and we're all going to be brought to the table, but they're not. And so decisions are being made without them, and then they're playing catch up. But they're very firm, and the players know full well that players in any sport are not just players, they're not just employees, they are also the product. And without them, you have nothing. So you don't want to lose that group. You want to be able to build on those relationships of trust.
What's the level of anxiety in Australia to bring sport back? And we've been graced with the NFL draft and the Last Dance, this replay of the great Bulls teams. What are you guys watching down there? What kinds of sports programming is available?
Well, I don't know if you've been doing this on your sports channels, but we've been replaying like historic games out of the vault, and I can't do it.
I think last time you mentioned when they were doing replays with
1983, Canterbury plays Parramatta. I mean, I knew the score in 1983. Why would I watch it again? My husband does, and a couple of my sons do, and they get all involved, and they're texting their friends, and oh yeah, remember that great moment. I can't do it, but then I'm a person that can't watch a movie twice because I know what happens. But so a lot of people, some people have been engaged with that. A lot of people have actually dropped their pay TV subscriptions, and this is also going to have quite a lasting effect on sport, because a lot of our big pay deals and our broadcast rights deals are done with Fox Sport here in Australia. But when Fox Sport came into Australia, I think they were expecting the same sort of take-up as you would have in the USA. And it's about 1/4 of, it's only in 25% of homes. And I know that through this period, as there's been no sport to be broadcast, a lot of people have cancelled their subscriptions. So Fox is actually in quite a delicate situation at the moment, and that has ramifications all the way through for a lot of our elite sports.
So Howard, that would be ideal for you, the guy who has not turned his TV on for a while here in the States. I mean, is that part of why you don't want to deal with the rebroadcast of games of which you know the outcome?
No, I love classic games. I watch them all the time. It is one of my favorite things, actually, because I think one of the reasons is simply because if we're making a parallel or a comparison to today, it's the games are great because you're not analyzing them. You're enjoying them for the actual art of sport. In fact, when we're watching games now, if you're watching a baseball game or a basketball game that's broadcast live, it's virtually all analytics. All you're doing is talking about the data. I actually watch sports for art. And so it's sort of fun going back and watching Barry Bonds or watching Michael Jordan or Larry Bird or watching those guys play. I remember my wife used to say all the time, "You already saw this game. Why are you watching it again?" I said, because I enjoy the game. It's actually, and I think Tracy brings up a really good point in terms of the percentages of what's in people's homes and what is going to stay and what's not. I think that there's a really good question taking place here, and I think it's starting to dominate, is this idea of effect versus damage. And right now we're feeling the effect of COVID-19, but we really haven't felt the total damage. And what I mean by damage is what restaurants don't come back, what sports don't come back, what percentage of fans don't come back. And what are the what are the layoffs, especially in media, if you're looking at our jobs, how many of our jobs don't come back because once they lay off, they don't really rehire in the same percentage numbers wise. So I think that it's going to be really interesting. And I think you're starting to see part of the pressure of reopening here is based on, let's get on with it. There are plenty of conversations to be had in terms of how this story has, how it's shifted. And one of the big issues here, Ken, as you know, as we were talking about, is once we started to see who was being mostly adversely affected by COVID-19, it was the poor minority, especially Black communities, that were being affected. Suddenly, there was this movement to say, okay, we can come back now because the most vulnerable amongst us are being affected and other people weren't. I think it's a really good point that Tracy brought up as well about the players, about how much conversation and how much impact do the players actually have, who's in the room. And we're finding out with baseball right now that there is a gap between what the Players Association wants and what Major League Baseball wants in terms of returning. And I've talked to some players and some coaches on the teams, and they're saying, listen, if they tell us to come back, we'll come back. Obviously, this is our profession, this is our job. But on the other, when you start talking logistically about what's going to happen, what does a game without fans actually look like? What does this actually look like? you're still talking about a couple hundred people in every event. You're still talking about the players actually having to collide with each other. The game is still very physical. All of it, you can't social distance when you're actually playing. So I think that the real issue for me so far has been, because the economics are driving this, how much are they driving this? And if they're driving it completely, what are we actually exposing ourselves to in this rush to come back?
Tracy, let me ask you, with that in mind, let me ask you another Australia-specific question. And Howard, you and I have talked about this offline a little bit. I mean, in the U.S., the president, not necessarily the government, has had conversations with sports leaders about bringing sport back and the timing of it. What's going on in Australia? There's some financial bailout kinds of conversations and other leadership conversations there. Could you talk about that, some of the role of government in the whole thing?
Sure. Our government came up with a program called JobKeeper, where basically they offered to pay like a minimum salary for jobs to be kept, so that if any organisations were in a situation, or any little businesses to major firms were in a situation where they were thinking of laying people off, this was an idea where the government would fund a minimum salary under JobKeeper, so they would be stood down, so to speak, but still receive this very basic income, with the expectation that they would come back once the restrictions have been released. The interesting thing has been that with all this talk about specifically NRL, the rugby league, they're talking about coming back and bringing the players back and resuming the competition. But a lot of the employees inside the NRL, and it's 100 plus, maybe 130 people, they've heard nothing about them coming back. And a lot of them are quite fearful that once the JobKeeper program from the government runs out in November, there is no job for them. And so this is exactly what Howard was talking about as well. These are the other concerns. But I also know that the sports minister here, we have a federal sports minister and then the various state sports ministers. But the federal sports minister has been very proactive in sitting down and speaking with a number of the sports, because we're talking about different levels as well. You've got the elite, then of course you've got that middle range where most people are, and then the grassroots and community sport. And so they've just come up with a big program of a 3-tiered reintroduction of sport, and they will all be based on various, medical yardsticks, if you like, to know how we're going in the community with COVID-19 before we can move from plan A to plan B to plan C.
Yeah, it'll be interesting around the world to see the role that government plays in the comeback, beyond the financial alone. Kendall, might be a good time to do a little poll here.
Absolutely. So we have a first poll that we would love to know your thoughts, and this is a great point in the conversation. Howard, you actually hit on this directly. I'm going to go ahead and relaunch it, but what we're asking is, do you think that we should expect players to return before the fans will? And obviously this means that this is before a vaccine has been readily available and distributed. So I'm relaunching this, and panelists, you can absolutely vote as well. So we'll give that a minute there. Get everybody's thoughts.
Should we expect players to return before the fans will? Okay.
Ken, there's also a really good question here. I think the professional side of it is important. I think the college side is even more important, because we're speaking about colleges and universities right now. I have people over here, some friends of mine who work at Boston University and Boston College, and some of them are saying that they are not necessarily expecting to come back until 2021, that they're preparing to not come back until maybe January. And if that's the case, how do you expect a student athlete to perform when his classmates or her classmates aren't going to class? What does that do to the question of amateurism? Doesn't that undermine the entire question of amateurism? That makes them employees to me, especially if you're taking the Mike Gundy position that we need to get college sports back to help economies and to help state economies. So on the professional side, I think it's actually an easier question than it is on the university side. I have a very hard time believing that you're going to be able to easily sell having college football start up if the universities aren't open.
Well, before we get the poll results, why don't we have a real former college athlete give some thoughts on that, the idea of college athletes coming back, and it's multi-dimensional, but what do you think, Victoria?
Sure. Well, you know, the majority of these conversations are about the Power Five, and the Power Five are predominantly white institutions, and the players of college football at these schools the rosters are majority Black, and in many cases heavily majority Black. So to not make it about this, but it's really revealing the purpose of this and the entertainment purpose of those students on those campuses. As Howard was saying, you know, it's revealing the myth or the con or the lie of amateurism, but it's also really underscoring how we see these lives as different from the lives of other students on our campuses.
So
I like drop a hammer for my first comment, but that's what it is.
we'd expect nothing less from you. Yeah, it is. I mean, to me, it is and Howard, I'm glad you raised it to really interject it into the rest of the conversation. I mean, you know, are you going to ask, you know, the pro athlete, you know, whatever economics has to do with decisions that you make, that's one thing. You're getting some compensation. So maybe there's something that makes you compensation versus life. I don't know. But for the college athlete, when you're getting let's just say no direct cash, and there's this new, and we may talk about at the end, NIL kind of faux cash that you may have the opportunity to get. It really is going to be dramatic to see how many athletes actually come back, especially if the rest of the students aren't asked to come back.
Yeah, and that's also important too, because I've seen some of the comments as it's weird when you're on an iPad, you're supposed to look at the camera, which is over here, but the comments are over there. So you need to pay attention to both. And I think that some of the comments said that the fall classes are starting up, or there's not a lot of jeopardy there. But what I'm concerned about when I'm thinking about that reentry isn't necessarily the opening, but the middle, because you follow the medical community, they're all already talking about a second wave. So do you start in September when you know that flu season begins a month from then and starts in October? So what does then happen to your reopening plans when you already know, if you follow the history and you follow the pattern of influenza, that you may have to shut it down anyway? So that's one of the things. It's not to suggest that, okay, this is going to continue all the way through summer, because we don't really know that, but you do know that virtually every model suggests that a second wave is coming somewhere around October.
So Kendall, the poll results, what we find out there?
All right, so it looks like we've got about 64% people that said yes, they should expect players to return before fans will. And this is for live stadium. And 28% said no. We had about 8% that weren't quite sure. I feel like I might land in that I don't know spot. But I think this is also very interesting, Ken, because when we asked in the first conversation, and Tracy, you may remember, we asked the question of like, is sport essential, right? And now this is kind of coming to a head of, are we changing that perspective? Is sport now essential enough to come back now that things are starting to open up? So it's very interesting. In the first one, we had a lot of people that were like, no, we are not ready. And now it kind of feels like, no, I think we are. We are definitely ready for people to start returning to normal.
It would also be interesting to know where each of those respondents came from, because I wonder if there's also a difference where those that are still quite heavily near the spike might have different concerns to those who are already seeing a major drop in the spike. And I guess we're seeing that around the world. But Howard, you raised a very good point about that second wave. And in Australia, we're just going into winter now. We just had our first cold snap 24 hours ago. And so people are thinking we've got under 1,000 active cases in all of Australia at the moment. So they're quite spread out. And I don't think many people are feeling as fearful as they would have been a week ago. But now that the cold snap has hit and winter is coming, you know, our second wave might be a whole lot closer than some other people's.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm.
So let's think about, let's shift over and begin to focus a little more specifically on the U.S. and the comeback there. And Howard, I'm going to kind of turn to you for insight on this. But we've, and correct me if I'm wrong. So far, we've heard about professional bull riding, NASCAR. These are the ones that look like they're going to be and PBR, I guess, has done something. The May group to come back in some kind of form without fans in the stands, that sort of thing. What are your thoughts on this? Is U.S. is $80 billion industry around the globe, $200 billion industry. Just to start off with the basics. I know you and I have talked about this, but I think it's a good place to go before we get to specifics on opening. With those kinds of numbers in terms of revenue and whatever else there is that people talk about, do sports fall into softball here, the essential category in terms of business?
Yeah, I do think it depends on your definition of essential. One of the things that we always talk about sports, especially in media and in newspapers, is they used to refer to it as the toy department, because it really wasn't essential. This was your diversion. This was something that was fun for you. And we always would say that sports relied on the illusion that it was important, that it was really important for my team to win. And it was really important to me what the Red Sox and Yankees did and all of that, and the Celtics and the Lakers and everything else. But now you start looking at it in terms of essential from another perspective, and that is the perspective of the economy. You start looking at the dollar amounts, especially these publicly financed stadiums that actually, where the states need their revenue to continue forward. And that changes the dynamic of essential. But what I do think is sort of also interesting when you're looking at what the reopening structure has been in terms of the committees. You've got the president who has essentially taken the owners of sport and commissioners of sports, and they've put them on this committee as equals to the medical community. And that is the message being sent to everybody, that financially they are essential. Financially, we need this to kickstart the economy. And I think also psychologically, when you're thinking about the term essential, we have to remember that it was Indian Wells, the tennis tournament out in California. It was Indian Wells that shut down first. And when they were first talking about that, I had tennis players and people in the business text me saying, we're overreacting, talking about the tennis community. And then the NBA followed up after that. And then Tom Hanks came down. It was, and his family, or his wife, got COVID in Australia. And so you realize that as much as we talk about essential and non-essential, it was sport and celebrity that got people moving on this, that where people really took their cues. And it's also going to be sport and celebrity that is going to give you your cues about whether it's okay to come outside. And so if you have, I think that Kendall, the poll was really interesting and telling in some ways and chilling in other ways, where on the one hand, you have people say, yes, I think it's time to come back out. I think it's time to go and reopen and get on with it. But then at the same time, you have people say, but I'm not going to the stadium. So, okay, so it's all right to have these games be played. But do you feel comfortable in a 50,000 seat arena with no spacing? Or hopping on an airplane? Because let's also not forget that part of the sports economy is travel. So you have a whole lot of teams traveling back and forth and crisscrossing the country if you're really going to restart this. So I think, Ken, that's the big question that when you're really thinking about the opening, the definition of essential. I think that the way when sports is talking about essential, when you hear people talking about essential, what they're really talking about is money. And they need this to kickstart the economy and psychologically to get people feeling like it's okay to get going again.
I'll come back in a minute and talk about specific sports, and maybe we'll start off with baseball or basketball, which now lost 260 games. That's 259, I think is the number. But Victoria, I want to ask you, take advantage of having a historian in here with us. Is there a historical precedent with sport? I mean, people talk about the 1918 pandemic or world wars and the like, but this whole question of when should we restart or not, pandemic related or otherwise, what kinds of things bigger than sport have we seen in history, and how have we decided to restart?
Sure. This is unprecedented. A pandemic of this nature globally, and acting on it, it is unprecedented in the modern sport era. So we do have another widespread pandemic that happened in the modern sport era, which was the Spanish flu. You know, we should be calling it the Kansas flu, but we call it the Spanish flu because the Spanish media covered it because they weren't participating in the war effort. And that's exactly what made that one different, as it coincided with the Great War. And so we weren't having it as our first priority. The war mobilization was the first priority, and we didn't even cover the flu to a certain degree. Howard's in Boston, and Boston was the epicenter of that flu, and the Red Sox included.
Mm-hmm.
So, and you know, if we're talking about women's sports, there aren't many lessons to draw from that other pandemic in the modern sport era.
Right.
The other historical moments we can look to, there's kind of two others. One are these world wars, these, you know, massive global wars, and then also, you know, global recessions and depressions. And I love what Howard was saying about what's deemed essential and what isn't, and how, you know, Ken, you mentioned these leaders, these sports leaders going to the White House and helping our president and the optics of that. Well, you know, there was only one leader of a women's sports organization included, and that was the LPGA, and our president happens to like golf. So, you know, what's deemed essential, and, you know, exactly, Howard, it all has to do with economics and money here. You know, women's sports, if we look in these historical moments, we humor the women. They're not deemed essential. If we're having to prioritize what's really important, and the people making decisions about what's really important are men, the women become an afterthought and they're first on the chopping block. And a lot of these women athletes weren't making enough in the first place. FIF Pro had a report published yesterday, and Telegraph Women's Sport covered it really well, pointing out that the world's best athletes in soccer specifically weren't paid enough in the first place to make a living before the pandemic hit. And so just one example of how we can look to world wars and how women are just being humored is the All-American Girls Professional Baseball League, which was launched, you know, in the World War II moment. We have FDR and the green light letter to Major League Baseball saying, you know, we need this, communities need this. And then we have these kind of marketing geniuses coming up with gimmicks to keep people entertained. And, you know, you have Wrigley having girls playing baseball. But once the men return home and everything goes back to usual, we say, okay, girls, you had your fun. We're going to shut this down. And that's so reflective of what goes on in the broader world. It's another moment at which sport is reflective or signaling or exemplifying what's going on in broader society, because you see the same thing. The women who are called upon to work during the wartime effort are now told, okay, go home and become homemakers again. And of course, there's differences in communities, and race is part of this too. Women of color have been working all throughout, but, you know, among middle class and mostly white families, those women went home. So if we want to be, you know, this pause button also gives us an opportunity to think strategically about the decisions we make, and we have to make sure we're protecting and prioritizing those who are the most vulnerable in this moment. Sure, we do need to make good business decisions, but we can also do it in a way that's inclusive and thinking about the people who've been trying so hard to get a foot in the door and get their sports promoted and supported.
So in our final reset segment, let us focus on some of those issues, what we might do differently. I mean, you've raised a couple of great communities to look at in that regard. But so Howard, back to you though. Let's start with. Well, first, you have any idea who will start first besides kind of these? You know, we see the Korean Baseball League, we see the PBR, NASCAR, that sort of thing. But of the big four in the U.S., any thoughts on who's first and how? Any insights?
Well, yeah. Well, what I think has been sort of wild about this is that the NFL has acted as if there's been no pandemic at all outside the draft, and from remote locations, they have not said anything about contingency plans. They haven't said anything about contingency plans for training camp, which is supposed to start up in a month and a half, or the mini camps start up later this month, and then you move forward into June and July, and then you have training camps. So they're moving forward as though nothing's happening. I think if you're the NBA, what you really for the NBA is they want their playoffs. And I wonder if they're willing, I think they are in some ways, willing to sacrifice much of the remainder of the season because, I mean, it's the NBA. You got 16 of, 30 teams that make, or 29 teams, 30 teams that make the playoffs. So, and what everybody really wants to see is the finals. It's going to be those top 2 to 3, 4 teams that everyone's worried about anyway. And so I think that you look at, I think it's going to really start depending on when they begin that reopening. It's going to be basketball and baseball because football is acting as if nothing has changed for them. So I think, so they're not even really part of it.
Is football going to, we have to assume behind the scenes they are making plan A, B, C, D, and that's certainly I agree with you. I agree. Right. If you think positively, all positive will occur. Now, I mean, I have to believe they're doing some things behind the scenes, and also.
I disagree with you, Ken, and the reason why I disagree with you is because I think that they believe that their schedule is advantageous to them. I think they believe that if you look at the pattern of the wave of what's taking place, that they're going to be minimally affected. So they're like, if we just keep our schedule as is, we're going to hit right when the weather gets really warm for training camps. That's when the pandemic numbers are supposed to go down. And that, when schools reopen and universities supposedly reopen, that's right when we open. So we don't really have to think about it.
Other thing I'm saying, in the great musical, The Music Man, the think system is utilized to teach people to play instruments. And they couldn't play in the end. And we see people thinking these things are going to happen, and it's just not happening. So,
yeah.
but that aside, we'll see if they do have a plan B.
I think the real issue here, Ken, is basketball, because I think that if you're looking at the different sports, I think the NBA is probably thinking, especially if you're going historically, they've already had strikes and lockouts where they've had 50-game seasons. So They've had seasons, they've done this before. So I think that their plan is, because let's not forget, the more you push back, if you think you're going to have a full season, the more you're pushing into next season. So eventually what I think that the battle is from the folks that I've been speaking with is how much do we truncate right now so we're not pushing each subsequent season into jeopardy. So I think that basketball is going to come up with some sort of plan over the next several weeks where they come out and say, okay, we're going to play the next 10 to 15 games or so. And then we're just going to have a playoff. And maybe they go short in playoff and they go 2 rounds, but I don't think they're going to go 3 to 4 rounds of 7 games anymore. But I think that their plan is if they can get a postseason into late summer, I think they're happy to go forward with that. And I think baseball, same thing. I think baseball wants to have an opening day sometime by June 1st, because even for them, that's a little bit of a different situation because you've got 162 games and not everybody's got warm weather facilities. So it's not like everyone's got a dome. I mean, you can't play baseball in December when you're in Boston and New York in those open air stadiums. So they've got much more of a challenge because baseball is dictated by the weather, which is why you're starting to hear conversations here about warm weather or single venue playoffs and all of those things. They take all the playoffs and play everything in a dome in Arizona or something like that, because the schedule is going to get into baseball. So to answer your question, I would say the sport that's got to have the most aggressive reentry strategy is probably the NBA, probably basketball.
Okay. And there's I mentioned the Korean Baseball Association. They've got this plan to start in May. Umpires will wear a face mask, which is kind of funny. They'll be wearing face masks anyway. No spitting, no spectators in stadiums, a full schedule.
Oh.
No spitting in baseball, right.
No crying either. No crying in baseball either.
And there's a plan for if anyone contracts the virus to ban players and suspension, all this sort of thing. So there is there are these strategies that are in place. We have a poll question, right, Kendall, that relates to this?
Yes. So really what we're kind of getting at too is this idea of how do we bring it back safely? How do we ensure that those that are not only the players, but thinking about, who's broadcasting, who's a part of this like elite group, and how do you keep them safe? So in the simplest of terms, we are looking at essentially your thoughts on the safety bubble. And do you think a safety bubble can be ensured before a vaccine, of course? Take a moment.
Yeah, I spoke to, I'm sorry, Tracy, did you have something to say there?
No?
Oh, I was going to say, I spoke with a couple of baseball folks that I keep in touch with. And one of the guys over at the Atlanta Braves was telling me that the numbers just don't really add up. However, people want to get on with it. And I think that this is the real interesting question when you talk about a safety bubble. What's really taking place here is that I don't think this is a safety issue. I think this is an issue where people really want to see sports be played. You know, I was talking with a member of the basketball union just a few days ago, and I said, what information do we have right now that suggests we can even get on with it at all? Do we have, I mean, did I miss some space where there's new information here? And so obviously, you know, there's a conversation about an expanded or accelerated vaccine or more testing and sort of that stuff. So that may give you a little bit more comfort in that, the ability to move forward. But I think that in terms of safety, I'm really not sure that there's been enough conversation to even answer that question accurately. Virtually every conversation I've had, I haven't spoken to a lot of football people, but virtually every basketball person, every baseball person, every tennis person, and tennis is actually a really interesting conversation too, because when Tracy was talking about the borders, tennis is an international sport. You've got different rules for every. Can you travel to these different places where you've got these far-flung tournaments all over the world? Every person that I've spoken with in sports so far has talked about re-entry based on two things: money and anxiety. They just want to get back on with it, and they're counting the dollars and the margins being very, very thin.
It's similar to my sitting in my house, and at some point, I'm just going to say, I need to get out of here. I mean, the idea that, you know, risk versus reward kind of thing. Let's just do this. So let's see on the poll result, how many people think there is a path. Look at that.
So we've got, interestingly enough, we have the yeses, 18% said yes, safety bubble can be ensured, and 68% said no, 14% still not sure.
Yeah, and I think of it, you know, I'm going to be the last one to go back. There's going to be, so I think Howard, you said, or maybe Kendall, you said, short of a vaccine, I may be in that vaccine camp that I'm going to continue on. My new normal will be established. And Howard and Tracy too, you might have some thoughts on this. One of the things that we've been talking about offline in the States, there was not a professional football team in Los Angeles for years, and actually almost a couple of decades. And Los Angeles survived just fine. Granted, they had other sports, and people began to develop other habits on Sundays with the main pro football day. Do you think there's a chance, and Tracy, I'll start with you, and then we'll move on to talking about the reset. Do you think there's a chance people could somewhat get out of the habit of sport? There's not a need that we're over projecting on this?
No, I don't think so. Not in a country like Australia. And there are a lot of people that are always very active on social media saying, well, that's it for me, the behaviour of those players. I'm never going back to a game of rugby league. I would challenge those people. They've probably never been to a game of rugby league to start with, you know. So there's all of that kind of, you've got to separate the people that are actually fans and those that might have an occasional interest because of somebody else. But I think the genuine fans will come back, and I think they're quite eager to see it come back. But having said that, I think the fans here in Australia are quite concerned about the health and the medical processes in place to protect the players. And it's quite interesting also that between our different sports, there are different levels of concerns. So Rugby League, that is talking about coming back as soon as possible, May 28 is their self-imposed deadline. The people that support Rugby League are a lot more, they're just all in, you know, it fits in with the style of the game. Everyone's just piling in on top of everybody else, and to hell with anything else. Whereas just over the border in Victoria, the main game there is AFL, Aussie Rules, and they are a lot more concerned. They haven't given any particular start date. They're working through these health requirements in a much more orderly way. It seems an orderly way. So again, it's sport versus sport. But one of the things that Howard mentioned there about, the NFL thinking that because of the dates, they're going to be protected and they'll just sit there and then come back as normal. What about the impact that this is having on broadcasters? Because I know cricket is our summer sport, and they thought they would be in that position where we'll just ride out the mayhem of COVID-19. It'll all relax and we'll come back nicely. But all of our broadcasters are now saying, we don't have the money we once did. And you are going to have an impact where the football seasons are now going to go longer. It's going to impact on the cricket season. So that's going to be truncated. We're not going to be able to sell advertising revenue. We need to renegotiate our broadcast fees, which then impacts on a whole, all of those other sectors that are involved in sport. So we think about sport, we think about the teams and the club and the governing body. But there's all of those other elements that feed into that, you know, whether you're talking about trainers or the ticket sellers or those that sell merchandise or the people that provide food on game days. All of these people are being so heavily impacted that it's such a chain reaction.
Yeah, and that I'd been talking with when I was talking with my Brave source, and he was saying that it's just not the players. It's not only the players. You're talking about, okay, you're going to have us in there, but you've got the training staff, you've got the medical staff, you've got the broadcasters, you've got the folks who are cleaning the stadium, you've got people on support. So even if you lock down a game and you say, okay, we're not going to have any fans there, you're still going to have 200 to 300 people involved in the support. And then what do? Do they go back to their families? Do they not? How do we make this work? How does this actually function? And I thought Victoria brought up a really good point as well when you were talking about whether or not women's sports was being sacrificed or who was actually being part of the conversation. And when she was talking about this, I thought you were going to go in the direction of the games went on during the wars, during Wimbledon. And Wimbledon shut down, but baseball didn't shut down. And so there were certain decisions that were being made for the morale, to Tracy's point, of essential. The United States made the decision that they weren't going to shut down because they thought sports were essential to our psyche, to keep us going, to keep us. But of course, the battle wasn't being fought on this soil. So of course you couldn't. It's kind of hard to play Wimbledon when London is being bombed. So it makes more sense in that regard. But I think the other point that you were making, Victoria, about women's sports was the needle movers. So when you're looking at this in terms of money, obviously the dollar amounts aren't the same, so you're not getting the same input. But one area where you do get that sort of input is tennis, because women's tennis is a big moneymaker. You've got Serena Williams, one of the biggest moneymakers in the world. And even in that regard, we haven't heard their voices nearly as much as we've heard from Novak Djokovic and Roger Federer and Rafa Nadal in terms of re-entry. And I think Tracy was talking about what it's going to look like coming back. There's conversation there about, I think Roger Federer brought it up last week, about maybe having the two sports merge. So obviously you're looking at what's the actual impact of this going to be, as we've been talking before, about, about impact versus damage, that the real damage of this, we're not going to know for a long time. And it's going to be interesting to see what sports actually looks like.
Victoria, I want to shift to you in our final segment to talk about reset. But I've been looking at the chat, and a number of people, I put on my lawyer hat here, have said that the other part of economics is the legal liability. Is that if you bring people back too soon, And if they die, they're going to be wrongful death
Yeah.
lawsuits. I mean, to the
Yeah.
extreme. So that certainly is in everybody's calculus about how rapidly should we bring
Yeah.
that back. I mean,
Yeah.
if too much anxiety strikes you, you start to think about, okay, what's the legal liability this going to hit?
Yeah, you know, I say it was really funny because the first weekend when I think it was tennis first, then basketball, then hockey was waiting, and then they shut down, and then baseball pushed back their regular season. And I see somebody, Jared Hector, brought up Wimbledon. Wimbledon was actually smart because I think it was SARS. They went and took out insurance. So they had tournament insurance, and I think a lot of the other sports didn't do that after the pandemic a few years ago. But I was going to say that I was speaking with a couple of union members, and they were saying in Major League Baseball side, they were talking about how, okay, well, let's get going, or let's not make any decisions. And one of their concerns at that time, this was the second week of March, was we don't want to look callous. We don't want to look like we're taking the players' health without taking the players' health into consideration, that we just want to play and we're going to sacrifice them for our money. And now that it's 6, 7, 8 weeks later, now you're hearing less of that, because I really wonder if people thought it was going to go on this long. And now you're starting to see maybe that financial conversation, that financial equation changing a bit because it's going longer than people wanted it to.
So Victoria, on reset, generally, what opportunities do we have, and specifically in the time we have, we really do want to zero in on women. What kinds of progress was being made that was halted, if there was progress being made, and what might we see differently? I mean, Howard named one of the great ideas, the idea of merging a sport, tennis, and having a single tour, which for a lot of reasons makes a lot of sense for a lot of people. But what's on your mind about it?
Yeah, thanks. Yeah, I mean, I think we've seen great examples of allyship in tennis for a long time. Preceding this pandemic, Andy Murray certainly has been a leader there. And yeah, this kind of effort started by Roger Federer, picking up by Rafael Nadal, and then, that's just gone on. And of course, you have Billie Jean King saying, yeah, I mean, we've been trying to do this.
That's what we wanted in the first place.
Yeah, I think it's fantastic. And, in the sport of basketball, we've seen great examples of allyship. Kobe Bryant, for sure, was someone who had really committed to supporting and growing the game of women's basketball before his death. Yeah, I think if we're thinking about a reset, we need allies right now. Women's sports need allies. The irony or tragedy or whatever you want to call it of 2019 being probably the greatest year in women's global sports history, and then to have this unexpected, just horrible global pandemic. And of course, this crisis is so much bigger than what's happening to women's sport. It's much bigger than that. But it's such a brutal irony that women's sports has its best year, and then something like this happens and can quash all that progress that had been made. So,
and what are some of the elements that made this 2019 the greatest year? What are some? Of course.
Yeah. So, first of all, women athletes, I think, are just fed up and tired of being kind of forgotten about or undervalued, and have been hustling for decades. So I don't want to dismiss all the work and all the great moments before 2019, but I think things really came to a head in track and field, for example, where you have Alicia Montano calling out the endorsement contract policies of not just Nike, but many athletic companies that were stopping, they were suspending the contracts of women athletes when they would get pregnant. You had Allyson Felix joining that, and moving from track, soccer, my goodness, the competitive balance across the top probably 16 teams of that FIFA Women's World Cup. I mean, we've never seen that sort of balance and equity across all the teams. That was, of course, the U.S. women's national team still won, but that was hands down the most competitive. And that's because women's professional soccer around the world has really elevated its game. I wrote a number of pieces around that World Cup talking about the potential leapfrogging of the U.S. that could be happening with other women's national teams around the world, because they are having kind of the investment and professional development that we're not necessarily seeing to the same scale in the U.S. So yeah, 2019 was a beautiful year for women in sport. We had a historic collective bargaining agreement where the WNBA players are getting more than they've ever had. And I mean, when we say this, it's things like they don't have to share hotel rooms anymore. So it's a great year, but it's also underscoring how little women athletes have had to begin with. So yeah, sorry, go ahead, Ken. Sorry.
No, I was going to say we're going to hit a time wall here in a moment. So I want to ask you, and I want to ask people in the chat specifically, and then Tracy and Howard too, to kind of close out your thoughts on what are the big things that sports should do on reset. They're given this, to whatever degree there's this second opportunity. As Howard said, the merger, and you agreed, the merger of men's and women's is one path. What else could happen on reset that would be a major positive? So both in the chat from everyone, but let's hear from each of the panelists as well, starting off with you, Victoria.
I think go ahead. Mm-hmm.
Sorry, am I going?
Yes, Victoria, please.
Okay, sorry. Well, we have this great thing in the US, which is Title IX. So we have a mechanism that forces, and I mean, maybe sometimes we don't do it as well as we could. And of course, it's all predicated on the monies being made by revenue generating sports, and there's problems there in college sports. But we do say when sports are in schools in the US, there must be gender equity because it's educational. So women have the equal opportunity to play school sports. We need a mechanism or a structure, something like that holds organizations around the world accountable. FIFA is certainly not a clean organization. It's probably the most corrupt of all these corrupt international sporting organizations. We need some sort of pledge or some sort of something to make sure the monies that had been allocated to growing and developing and supporting the women's game actually are going to women moving forward. So we can't pass some sort of international law implementing gender equity. We can at least put pressure on leagues around the world that do have this tethering, like in Mexico, Liga MX, every men's side has a women's side now. Like, we can get people to buy in and pledge to building more gender equity into sport moving forward. And again, this kind of pause button gives us the opportunity to really think about, responsibly and ethically about what we can do to continue to build equity, and not just gender, and always making sport this inclusive space going forward. So that's what I want. I want to pledge, and I want a sports czar.
Okay. Howard, and then Tracy, we'll close out from Australia.
Yeah. I think there are so many opportunities when you have this sort of reset. You've got this space in between. Obviously, there's an opportunity for the teams and the players to have better relationships. I think that this was a great moment, or it has been, and we'll see once we get back to some form of routine, if the players got left out of the conversation or if they actually had that sort of partnership. I think Tracy brought it up earlier in this conversation about the revenue split in the NBA. And normally what you have in especially in American team sports, you've got financial revenue sharing, but you don't necessarily have power sharing. And so I think this is an opportunity to talk a little bit more about the players and the safety and what this is all going to look like. I also think that there's an opportunity too, as we think about it, I mean, less from a financial standpoint, but my big concern with all of this right now too is this idea that we are sacrificing the players because they're rich and because we want to see our entertainment continue. So I'm hoping as well that when you hear people talk about taking care of the athletes and the safety of the athletes and all of these different things, that we also make a point that part of that point is understanding that just because they may make, $8, $9, $10 million a year, doesn't mean that they can be sacrificed to entertain us. And so I think it's going to be, once again, the financials on this are driving it. I'm hoping that what we're also going to see is that spirit of community in terms of the health and safety of the athletes as well.
And Tracy, on our last one, you talked about how sport needs to come back, but it needs to come back better. You want to give some additional thoughts, and we've got a couple weeks later, what your thinking is on the reset now?
Yeah, I think a lot of people are still talking about, and I know there's a great concern that we're not going to get back to normal until there's some sort of a vaccine. But a lot of experts also say there may never be a vaccine. You know, this is a coronavirus like SARS, and there was never a vaccine for SARS. And so I think part of that new normal is that we need to be able to have in our back pocket, or the back pocket of every sports organisation and every sports broadcasting organisation that funds sport to such a degree, how do we operate with our plan B or C when this thing arises again? There are serious concerns about the Tokyo Olympic Games. If there's no vaccine, can you have an Olympic Games and bring all of those people together? And we know what happens when people are put together in an incubator like an Olympic village. So all of these conversations still need to be had. And I just hope that in the immediate panic of trying to get sports back for the next season or resumption of the season, that we don't lose sight of that much bigger picture, that this may happen again. This is the new reality. This is a world with a population of 6 billion people, and we all travel in and out. We fly in and out. The athletes are traveling around the globe. We're all kind of in that department as being a guilty party. So we have to find a new way to deal with these sorts of pandemics, because they will mutate. It'll be something else in a couple of years' time. So I think these are really good moments for pause for sports organisations to be able to say, okay, all the money we got, we put to paying players more. We need to pull some of that back. We need to hive some off for these sorts of major dilemmas that are going to come our way. And we also need to make sure that we're filtering that down to all of those other sectors that we need to grow as we continue to move forward with women's sport, with sport for disability, with community sport, because without the community sport, you don't have the elite sport. So it's a bit of big picture thinking that is now on everybody's shoulders.
Yeah, that's a really...
Yeah, Howard, please.
I was going to I just say one last thing off of what Tracy said.
Sure.
I think that it's really important as well, as we find out what's driving this, as we said earlier, if we conclude that sport is driving the reopening because the financials look really terrible, it sends an awful message to the lower levels. It sends a terrible message to the colleges and the high schools and everything else, because it says, once again, that your health and your safety is secondary to what revenues you can generate for us. So it's a real interesting balance there.
Well, I'm glad we ended again with a little thought on the responding to the new abnormal, as I said earlier, and as Tracy has characterized it. And this is going to be with us for a while, probably longer than we all anticipate. And we will continue to have these GSM lives to talk about these issues and more specific ones. On May 15th, we're going to have a conversation on COVID-19 and the impact on Native American sport. So especially being here in Arizona, it's an important issue to look at, and it's been just a pure tragedy on the Native reservations in this area especially. So let me turn it over to Kendall to thank all the panelists and some closing information.
Yes, thank you so much, panelists. To our host, of course, Candace Shropshire. Thanks again, everybody, for great conversations in the chat box there, too. We are going to just hang on for a little bit. I'll go ahead and dismiss all of our panelists there. Along with our GSM live shows, if you're not familiar, we also do a podcast show. So we will, in the chat box, be providing a little bit more information for you all on our GSM live show, where you can sign up for that next one on the 15th. And we have, of course, our podcast series, GSM podcast, that we have been discussing the impact of COVID-19 most recently with the NFL and the draft, and we'll continue those conversations too. So panelists, thank you again so much, especially Tracy. We've said this offline, but I'm going to say it online. Thank you for joining us at your 4 a.m. I promise next time we will be very global with you.
Thank you. Thank you.
All right. Thank you so much, panelists.